Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Sustainable Connections podcast. If you're someone who listens regularly, welcome back, and you'll be familiar with my voice. I'm Mark Lee. I'm the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM. We run Sustainable Connections mostly to have conversations with the people we work with in the sustainability field, kind of emphasizing that connections and partnerships aspect and figuring out the things we can do together to drive the sustainability agenda forward. But we'll sometimes pause and examine something that's happened in the field or one of the major events. And today is one of the latter types of episodes where we're going to delve into what happened last week, the week of June 23rd, at London Climate Action Week 2025. If you know the event, it's been running for 7 years, packed with representatives from the public and private sector, as well as civil society. This year, 45,000 people showed up in London for more than 700 events. That's the kind of known total. By far, the biggest London Climate Action Week ever. As an organization, ERM had about 50 people there. And I have 3 of those folks who were on the ground in London last week with me today. And so in this episode, we're going to kind of delve into some reflections on the event generally, and we're going to explore some of the key themes that emerged, particularly for business. So I want to introduce my colleagues who are with me and bring all of them into this conversation. 3 folks, like I said, farthest flung from me, and I'm sitting in California today at home in the San Francisco Bay Area, is Linden Edgell, who is our Global Sustainability Director, and she is back home already in Perth, Australia. Welcome, Linden. Great to have you here.
Hi, Mark, and hi, Andrew and Mathias.
And hints there about who else we've got. So I'll go in the order that Linden did. We also have Andrew Probert, who is our Northern Europe co-managing partner at ERM, based in the UK. And also, I'll get you both, Mathias Lelievre, who is our EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa regional CEO. Welcome, Andrew and Mathias.
Hey, Mark, great to be here.
I just want to give everybody a sense of what happened last week. I've been to COPs and New York Climate Week. I've never been to the London event, but the scale of these can overwhelm. It's almost hard to figure out where the center of gravity is. You were all there. What did it feel like? Just give me a highlight, something that stood out, maybe the tone of the event. And why don't we come back in the same order that we briefly introduced you there? So Linden, please set the stage.
Well, as you all might remember, a week to 10 days ago, there was a lot going on in the world at the time we landed in London. But I found the whole week surprisingly upbeat, and there was a really positive mood around London, not just because summer had arrived, I think, but because of the energy everyone brought.
Still lots going on in the world, of course. And yeah, it was a rather sensational weekend right before London, and glad the event came off the way it did. And I imagine some people's travel probably got complicated. Andrew, what was your sense of the feeling of the event?
From my perspective, Mark, I agree with what Lyndon said. There's a huge amount of optimism. I think if you look over the last kind of few months, there's been a lot of headwinds in sustainability, a lot of companies kind of publicly maybe scaling back on some of their ambitions, or certainly kind of what they're saying about it publicly. But what I was hearing on the ground was very different. I was hearing lots of companies who were, staying the course. Some were doubling down on their efforts. They might not be making big public statements about it. But what I heard is they were still fully invested into, sustainably transforming their businesses and actually moving much more from kind of the theoretical into the operational and actually beginning to deliver. And many of those were actually starting to realize the value that you can achieve by doing so. So yeah, a huge amount of optimism for me coming out this week.
This is all excellent news so far. Mathias, pressure's probably on you to fall in line with optimism, but you can say whatever you want. What was your week like?
Thanks, Mark. Look, it was really a breath of fresh air, and listening to all those great conversation, corporate leaders from around the world. And I like very much the format of so many events, pretty small scale, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, and massive networking, talking about the reality of this action that Andrew was referring to, right? The agenda, the sustainability agenda is still very much moving. And we had so many in-depth conversation, not high level, but really in-depth, what's going on for each company, this company, everybody sharing. So that was really refreshing and very much needed at this time.
Excellent. No, it sounds like there was a real operational quality perhaps to the conversations too. Linden, we've already said, 700 events, 45,000 people. That inevitably means everybody gets a slice of these kind of macro sessions. In that mix, ERM ran about 10 events of our own. And can you just give us a flavor of what elements seem to resonate with the participants at the sessions that we were at, that you were at, the kind of thread of conversations that you found running through?
We had talked to our clients beforehand and said, what do you want? What would be of value to you during London Climate Action Week? And the message came back to us, which was, let's get specific. Let's really focus in on the topics that we're having real challenges with or need to collaborate with. So let's get really specific. Let's get into smaller rooms so we can have conversations. Yes, we want to meet with some of our own tribe, but actually, could you help us meet other people? So either those up and down our value chain, our suppliers and our customers, and our peers in other value chains, in other sectors, who may have, things that we can share. So we made a real attempt to make sure that we had different folks in the room who could benefit from that engagement. We hosted 10, but we did it with partners because we also believe in collaboration. So we worked with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on a number of sessions, including on long duration energy storage, on the decarbonisation of industrial heat. With the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, we did one around nature and climate benefits in the climate markets. We also collaborated with the Green Finance Institute, where we've just written a paper about carbon and dioxide removals in the UK. So again, we really believed that by that collaboration, we can get different folks in the room bringing those perspectives. But overall, it was about solutions. We might have had the first minute or two when we met each other over coffee, kind of going, wow, this is a pretty happening world. But pretty quickly, people got into solutions. And I think that was the thread that I really picked up from the events we hosted.
Yeah, and sounds like there was a questing for solutions too. It's interesting that people were that eager to be outside their own value chains and engaging new and different people who maybe could bring them different ideas. We're going to get specific and delve into some of those really individual topics, but first want to stick for a moment at the higher level. And Mathias, Linden referenced the events of the weekend prior to London Climate Action Week. And to be fair to our listeners out there, if you're not tracking the calendar, that was the weekend that the US was bombing the nuclear facilities in Iran. And that's, a reflection of the kind of state of the world where we have armed conflict, we have other types of geopolitical conflict in the form of trade and tariff wars. It's a period of quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of where economies are going and even the shape of them. And do we agree how to run them? A testing of post-war order, if you will, and probably shifting of power in different directions. And those tensions go well beyond the political stresses and strains in society also. So if this kind of volatility is the normal that we are all living in, then how did those circumstances shape the conversations that were happening in London last week?
I think everybody came with that understanding of very challenging environment, very volatile. You describe it, Mark. I would add even the regulatory landscape is moving, right? In continental Europe, not so long ago, we had some massive changes in the rules. And so this feeling of, not knowing what the next day will come and the sustainability agenda being a bit under attack, it was obviously, as Linden said, kind of the conversation starter. But I was just to move right away into, okay, what do we do about this? And how do we make sure that we're still progressing? And I think what came out of that was a strong reinforcement of what we heard over the last few months, which is it's not because we corporate leaders talk less about it that we means that we are deprioritizing. Somehow we still getting things moving, but it's less of a political conversation, if you will. It's more like an operational conversation. So really no nonsense conversation, right? What are the things that really make sense because they are both compatible with the sustainability agenda and compatible with my business strategy? It means reprioritization, if you will, of what are the 2-3 topics that are not changing. The North Star is set, and it's all about making progress in the short term. And obviously, climate is very high on that list. And then it's about the conversation around managing the pace of the transition. Should I go faster, slower, adapt my pace of change, of transformation to what I'm seeing are being just a bit in advance. And we had the colors almost of all of that, depending on the conversation, because at the end of the day, there's a few things that doesn't change. And the first one is like, there's no silver bullet. It's just the solutions are all different depending on the business context of each corporate. So everybody is advancing depending on where they come from, depending on what is really important for them, depending on if you are in mining sector, the finance sector, the industrial sector. You have very different priorities, but everybody is still trying to make progress. So for me, that was really what was the highlight, was acknowledging the volatility and that very challenging environment. And on the other side, heads down, get things moving, very operational conversation.
Yeah, and some interesting threads in there for me, the sense that it's just a question of pace. We're doing this, but we've got to find the right pace in these times. And somewhere in the early middle part of your response there, Mathias, you said something about finding solutions that work for sustainability and fit within the rest of the volatility. And I think some of the conversations I've been drawn into lately have been about supply chains, which are affected by trade and tariffs, and they're also affected by physical supply chain risk. And I see companies going out and trying to find things they can work on that will help solve more than one of the big challenges that we're kind of swimming around in. Andrew, I'm going to pull to you and move to one of those specifics. And another seeming, I don't know if it's buzzy yet, but building conversation feels like it's around financial quantification. That sounds like something business people should say, right? That if we're going to do this, we're going to put it in monetary terms. We're going to figure out how climate translates to the balance sheet. And then there's the challenge of actually doing that in a way that makes sense to stakeholders and investors. I know you've both been doing some research with partners, including WBCSD, on this and applying it with our clients. Can you explain what this looks like in practice? Maybe give us an example.
Happy to, Mark. And just building on what Mathias was saying around kind of the volatility at the moment and why this is critically important. I think we've seen ESG historically, sustainability more generally, as being seen as a risk mitigant. I think physical climate risk is one of the most obvious ones, trying to understand the impact on our business and trying to quantify that. I think there's a brief period of time, maybe towards the tail end of last year, where we started seeing maybe there's competitive advantages. And how do we kind of understand where there's value creation opportunities? I think with the volatility that has come probably since certain elections globally towards the tail end of last year, we're into a kind of a business resilience environment at the moment. To Mathias's point, trying to prioritize the areas that are going to protect value in the short term, but create value in the long term. And in that regard, that prioritization, this is where the financial quantification becomes really important, because during the periods of volatility, allocation of resources, of capital, is really important. Making those decisions is really critical when you have scarce resources, human resources, as well as kind of financial resources. So we've been working over the past year around how do we start to quantify the financial impacts of all of the relevant aspects of sustainability, including physical climate risk, including transition risk, but also looking at, to your point, supply chains, looking at human rights issues, understanding the overall impact on value of the business, and how do we do that to prioritize the areas that are going to enhance in the short-term business resilience during this volatile period, and then in the long term start to create and protect value. So we look at it quite holistically. I think if you look at certain levers, you can understand maybe directly where there's the possibility of working out a financial impact. And let's take decarbonization as an example. Here, you can quite quickly move into, there's a direct energy saving that has a cost benefit to you. But actually, for us, we start looking a bit more holistically. You look at the dependencies, interdependencies, and you realize there's opportunities to protect revenue through that decarbonization. If you sit within a supply chain, there's opportunities to create value through the same agenda, right? So if we are looking, if you're sitting within a supply chain, or you're talking and engaging with your own supply chain, there's opportunities for you to differentiate your products. Now, we've done a lot of work around trying to ascertain which industries you can apply a green premium to certain products. We think that's probably fairly limited in reality, but what it does give you in the business resilience is the opportunity to protect existing revenue, because companies themselves have got their own ambitions, their own targets. They're moving into action now, as we heard all of last week. So if you can accelerate your energy transition, the opportunity is decarbonize. You've got the opportunity to protect revenue as well as to grow revenue. And then you start really being able to, once you be able to quantify those impacts, you can then start engaging with very critical party in all of this, those allocators of finance. You've got the opportunity to actually be able to prove that there is value to be had within your business. The allocation of capital internally or externally gives them the opportunity to create value beyond what that business would be doing if it stayed as it was today.
And Andrew, a whole bunch of things in there. And the lack of green premium, but the opportunity to protect market share, does that mean it's just a defensive play? You hinted at maybe seizing new markets with this approach as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a protection piece, but obviously what we heard consistently across the whole week, very slightly B2B and B2C, but generally speaking, people were still in this environment. And again, when you're in a slightly volatile period of time, when there's pressures on margins, there's pressures on resources, people want the best product and the best price that's delivered on time. And if you can meet all of those three criteria, you're then into a period of differentiation. And people still want, because of the target setting, to look at sustainability as one of those levers. So you have an opportunity in this environment. So provided you still are able to produce the same product, maybe even at a better quality, you've got the opportunity to start taking market share where you can really differentiate yourself with a good sustainability story. And not just a story, but actually, here's where the quantification comes into play. You've been able to quantify the impact of it. You can directly measure carbon footprint. You can directly point towards improvements in employee health and safety, etc. People want to buy into that. If it really becomes a differentiator, they'll start shifting in towards you compared to your competitors. But still in the current environment, price, quality, delivery, etc. Those are all the most critical things. But delivery is an interesting one. Sorry, just to labor the point, Mark, but this is where it comes into when you're talking about supply chains, but looking at the impact of your supply chain as a result of climate change, right? So is the drought causing you an issue getting through the Panama Canal because it becomes too expensive, or there's not enough slots, or there's a drought, so you have to reroute? That takes longer. Like, what are you doing to start looking at your supply chain from that perspective? How can you increase business resilience? And that's where it comes into those interdependencies. I think people increasingly now need to look 1, 2, 3 degrees beyond that direct impact to really start to quantify the overall financial impact of climate change, transition, etc. on the business.
I like the pull through there, and it feels like investors and other stakeholders are not going to jump at something simply because it is presented as more sustainable, but only when it is presented as more sustainable in a way that actually makes the business more robust at the same time. Mathias, I'm going to spin back to you. And Andrew kind of hinted at opportunities. The other way I'm thinking about opportunities is that as volatile as the current operating environment is, that's kind of when things emerge, sometimes because everyone's off balanced and because things are so dynamic. Are you looking at this landscape right now and bold enough to say that as messy as it is, this is a great time to be searching for opportunity? And can you see any? Where would you point?
I'm going to make a bridge between what Andrew just shared and your question. Last week, I was in a conversation, and one of the business leader is a B2B, is operating in the B2B business, and his clients are a B2C client. So directly exposed to every consumers, every one of us. And he was saying that to participate now and answer his clients, he had to obviously show a trajectory of decarbonization that was SBTi compliant. He also shared that he had to more and more be able to tell its clients what was the carbon content of the product he was selling and trace back the level of carbon by product, if you will. And he was making the comment that he was gaining market share. He was beating competition because he was able to be at the right price point. So no premium, right? But he was able to be at the right price point and better from a carbon content perspective. That's super interesting, right? Because that's where you can quantify the value, and then you can have a market share gain out of the actions you took to decarbonize your business. And that's actually why I'm very optimistic about the time we are experiencing and living, because the reality of the actions are coming out, the reality of the ambitions that are not just ambition and words on a poster and just people talking on stage. things that are getting done with real climate impact, we're going to see the reality of that, and we're going to see the winners and the ones that were just talking. And that's going to be really interesting. And, last week we had so many conversations around resilience in the sense of real value you could attribute to the fact that your energy supply chain was not only greener, but more predictable. And so you could model right away the economic benefits of that. We had conversation around interesting, more emerging in a way, but how to adapt to the physical climate risk and the problem of some assets that cannot be insured anymore. And if you can insure them, well, you have a bit of a problem in terms of value of those assets, in terms of debt and financing. So, real, very concrete conversation around dollar value of some assets in some portfolio of investments. We had some conversation around decarb implementation, energy efficiency program, 5, 10, 15% OPEX, less OPEX, with some return on investment less than 4 years. I mean, those were the conversations. Then obviously continuous massive amount of money invest on onshore renewable and storage, a big theme of investment. So, those conversations very anchored, very real, they made me very optimistic because yes, challenging time, but time of truth about who's serious in this game.
Yeah, challenging time, but one in which, great evidence there of opportunity that is still available. And goodness, whenever any business gets to a point when they see something that has 15% OPEX kind of advantage, they should be leaping at it with a sustainability label on it or not, but especially if it brings those benefits as well. Linden, a different kind of impact, and it's thinking about, more the communities and other stakeholders that are affected as companies work on their climate ambitions. And one of the conversations we've been having inside ERM, and I know you participated in London, was about kind of localized approaches, thinking what happens when companies and investors really take the time to understand what's going on at local level, which is, of course, where many climate and also nature and other impacts tend to play out. Do you see that accelerating in the conversation? What's going on in that degree?
We've heard the term global and local, on and off over the years, but it feels like one of those moments where it really has returned. Why? Well, physical risks are playing out differently in different parts of the world. We have simultaneous droughts, floods, etc. going on in different parts. We are also seeing real differences in the way governments are approaching policy, regulation, tax incentives or disincentives, compliance, etc. And so at that level, it's very different. And then we have very different ways that societies are thinking about a future, and indeed, consumers and the choices that consumers are willing to make. And we heard some examples there earlier. So if you're not tuned in every place that you're operating into those layers of things that are going on, then how can you possibly navigate this transition in a way that's effective to create the opportunity we've just heard of, to even think about the financial kind of quantification? And so I think for me, just again, talking to people from all over the world, we had quite a contingent from Asia in London for the first time, and they were seeing opportunity everywhere. Their kind of view is, there's other parts of the world that are a bit distracted. That's the moment that we want to make sure we are there and we are providing for the market. We are in most companies' supply chains somewhere, any global entities. Asia is there. And if we can at this moment differentiate ourselves, as was described, then we will be there. So I think, yes, there's that kind of global North Star that Mathias talked about. At an implementation level, you very much need to be listening, engaging locally with stakeholders and building that into your transition planning.
Okay, and Linden, I'm going to keep you going for a minute. And as soon as we get into the sort of people and social aspect of climate planning, climate transition, we often end up talking about the just transition and how we ensure that the transition to net zero is inclusive, kind of works for everybody, not just works for some. As much as that term has been part of the, at least, climate lexicon for a number of years, I don't know that everybody really knows what it means yet, especially how business is supposed to get their hands around it. And I just wonder if you can explain the term and how business is applying it in practice at this stage of our work on the climate journey?
I think you're right, Mark. And in fact, that's why we are currently working on the Business Leaders Guide to the Just Transition, which
Great.
we will be launching at COP30 in Brazil later in the year. And we're working on that with the World Business Council and co-leading the Just Transition Working Group. And so we're trying to take that complexity and to kind of think about how do we actually engage our business leaders on that topic. And in fact, we spent 3 hours on Wednesday afternoon with about 30 companies really working through this topic. And to get 30 companies to commit to 3 hours on a hot Wednesday afternoon in London, you know that it's an important topic. I guess we really talked about there's two things you really need to be thinking about. So as you're thinking about your transition plans, and many companies are on this way, is you need to be firstly thinking about what is going on for the people that you are dealing with. What are the climate change impacts that are affecting those people? That might be your employees who are facing hotter days at home with or without air conditioning, who are trying to get to and from work, perhaps in extreme weather conditions. Perhaps it's your suppliers that are facing real obstacles trying to get through the Panama Canal or other things as well. Maybe it's the society, the communities in which you have your assets or that you're trying to sell into, who are facing increasing energy bills or other things, and therefore their kind of capacity to pay is different. So you need to understand, how is climate impacting those people today? So that's part one. Part two is, how are the actions that you are taking as a company, and that might be mitigating actions or adaptation actions, how may they affect those same group of peoples? And again, that might be your direct employers, it might be supply chain, it might be society you're working with, or it might be other stakeholders. So if you kind of think about those two dimensions and you work through those different stakeholder groups in a very systematic way and in a very integrated way, you cannot be having those conversations in isolation. You need to have your HR team there, your procurement team there, your operations people on the ground, the employees themselves, the suppliers themselves. You need to be having those conversations and really factoring in what is going on. Otherwise, you're going to have a blind spot. And in fact, one of the things that surprised me, a number of very large companies with significant physical assets talked about the fact that their teams had done physical risk assessments at an asset level and completely forgotten about the people dimension. So they could tell you every which way that it may go underwater or it might be hit by a hurricane or a cyclone. And when the social team said, and have you thought about whether your employees could actually ever get to work at that moment, or your supply chain would continue, there were these blank faces. Now, what's the point of a physical risk assessment if you haven't thought about some of those other components? So Just Transition is really at the base thinking about that, and there's a lot more to come, but I think people have to be in the middle with climate and with nature.
Yeah, it sounds like there is the very basic level of the thinking, but also it's about interconnection, that we do need both the physical asset risk assessment and the people risk assessment, and to put them together. We can't have these teams operate sort of in isolation from one another. Sounds like we're hinting there at the ways to make transition plans inclusive and equitable and effective at the same time. Mathias, you talked in some of your previous comments about, implementation and almost figuring out the way to focus on the operational, even in this moment that we're living in. Sometimes when companies talk about what they can or can't do in terms of climate progress, they point at governments and civil society and say, without that policy or without that to enable us, we can't move forward. Frankly, right now, that support is uncertain. We're seeing regulation move in sometimes conflicting directions, sometimes rolling back. We've recently done a survey which says people's confidence in civil society to drive the sustainable development transition is falling. How do companies strengthen their sustainability strategies and advance their goals without those external supports? Can they do anything about that, or is that just a risk they have to accept?
Well, look, I think the family of actions that require some level of state support or public support, there are so many that do not require that support, right? So I would say first, companies need to go for those items on the agenda that really intersect with the business strategy. If it's a cost reduction moment, hey, why don't you go for those energy saving programs? Why don't you find out if on-site renewable production might be actually better than the current cost in some location? let's try to be cognizant of the moment in which the broader business is living, reprioritize from that perspective, as Andrew was mentioning, put dollars value on those items. Let's justify why the investment is the right one. Two additional elements I'm thinking about. One, partnering and building the right alliances from a value perspective, not just alliance for alliance or partner for partner, but find somebody who can help you get things done, commit on the outcomes of those programs, find the people who are in the same situation than you when it comes to your supply chain, come together, find a solution. There are very concrete elements that could be prioritized there. And then the last piece is really, how do we reframe the narrative to account for volatility, value-driven action, and keep that North Star longer-term action alive? How do you mix those three? Not so easy, but I think that's part of what's coming and what should be at the top of the agenda.
I like the mix of the three, and this field often seems about mixing and getting the right elements in place to do quite complicated transitions in single companies and across value chains. I'm going to ask all of you to answer one more question, and then we'll let you and our listeners go. So often in the climate field, we're talking about the goals for 2030 or the goals for 2050. It's this very long-term agenda. It sort of feels remote and slow moving, and it also feels like we're in a race. From London Climate Action Week, maybe the next biggest event on the agenda is the New York version of the same in September. And then Linden, you already referenced COP30 coming up in Brazil towards the end of the year. So kind of keeping that long-term goal in mind that we want a low carbon, just economy and transition to have happened by mid-century. Based on what you heard at London Climate Action Week, what are the things for companies to focus on in the next 6 or 12 months as we move through those next big events to keep momentum moving, or really to build more momentum such that those long-term goals stay in reach? I'm just going to ask each of you to pass through that with your crystal ball in hand, and Andrew, ask you to tackle it first.
I remember an old colleague of mine, probably over 10 years ago, said that data was the new oil. And we all kind of hope it's true for kind of several reasons. But for me, the focus of attention at the moment, there's a lot of pain points around collating data for sustainable reporting, the process has to go through. There has been some pushback around some regulations around it. But what it has done is it's identified this huge volume of data and insights that are now available to businesses that they never had before. And for me, the next 6 to 12 months is around using all of these new data points to identify the risks, the opportunities, the interdependencies, and the opportunity to not just build business resilience and the impact of climate change, the energy transition, et cetera, has on your business, but to be able to turn those into real value drivers. So how can companies look at what they've now got available to them, start being able to interpret all of these new data points, triangulate them with their business strategy, and identify those opportunities to enhance their business resilience and to create enterprise value? So for me, that's going to be the big focus in the short term.
So we've got to harness all of what's available to us right now. This would probably lead to a whole other conversation about maybe AI's power to help with some of that, but we'll leave it for another day. Linden, what's your look ahead?
It's around kind of leadership and communication. There was a lot of discussion. I think Andrew referenced it at the top of the call, that there's a lot going on, but people aren't necessarily talking about it. Some are using the term green hushing to describe that. I do think business leaders really need to make some decisions here, because if there isn't the conversation around, if there isn't those willing to stand up and talk about what's important across the sustainability agenda and why they are taking climate action, then there's a real risk that we are going to lose momentum, and that we've got all of the governments of the world are due to submit their NDCs, effectively their country plans on climate. They're also supposed to be producing national adaptation plans this year, and I think got NBSAPs, which are their sort of equivalent in nature. Now, if business is not in there explaining to government why they want effective policy, why it's important, and why that certainty for business is required, then in the absence of those voices talking about the progressive agenda, then things will continue to recede. And so I think business leaders need to find a way to really demonstrate the things that they need for the unlocks. And we had Anna Toney, the CEO of COP30, with us on day one, and she very much talked about Be specific. Tell us what the unlocks are from business side. Then we can work with governments to actually address them at a level of detail. And I think that's the message. What does that really look like so that we keep things moving forward? And how we're going to keep articulating how business is willing to contribute, but we've got to be in there in a leadership position.
Yeah, I think really interesting and something that's bothering me these days, Linden. So I'm going to editorialize for 1 minute before I go to you, Mathias. And it's the sense that, well, the green hushing moment, if that's what we're in, is understandable on a bunch of levels as companies try to navigate shifting policy and avoid some of the backlash that is out there coming back on them. I think when we're in really complex societal transformations, visible leadership's required. It's not going to happen if everybody just goes off in a corner and quietly does their own thing, light under a bushel. We need to see some examples, and we need to understand what's working across value chains. And that will mean, again, companies and other institutions figuring out what their narrative is in the climate transition and communicating it to others, both as a compelling business case and as some degree of inspiration and example, the whole gamut that I don't think we can all remain quiet for too long. So forgive me the soapbox. Mathias, your thoughts on what needs to be done in the next 6 to 12 months?
I really like the points that Andrew made on comms and then kind of strengthening the foundation, particularly data. I guess my addition would be, kind of what I was talking about, super strong focus. Don't embrace everything too large, too complex, and super prioritization on places where you can show dollars value attached to the programs you want to run first. And that's the financial quantification. It's tough. It's never easy, some uncertainty, but how is that different from other things you do every day? It's not actually. So let's put some dollars around that and then find the right internal mechanism to convince, because now you can talk value and get things done. I think that's the highest priority now.
Putting the numbers behind it, doing the hard things, because being successful in business is hard. It's a challenge. The sustainability part of this is no different. We're at that point where we will wrap up, and I'll say thank you to all three of you as panelists. Really appreciate your time and giving us this kind of breakdown of what happened last week at London Climate Action Week 2025. Also want to thank the listeners who've stuck with us through the conversation. If you found Sustainable Connections on one of your platforms, all of our back episodes are there, as well as on erm.com. We'd love you to explore the series, and we'd also appreciate any feedback that you might have for us. So with that, thanks so much to all three of you one more time. Thanks to everyone who stuck with us for the episode, and best wishes for now.